at this 9 of the morning UK time and many other different times around the world. We're welcoming today Professor Raewyn Connell, who has very kindly agreed to talk to us. And we're very, very happy to have you. As many of you might know, but maybe for some of you it's new, joining our Oxford Southernizing Criminology discussion group. My name is Carla Sepúlveda, and I'm co-convening this group together with Luis Dal Santo. Today, we will be hearing Professor Raewyn Connell, and after that we will have a discussion. So just very briefly to let you know, we're a student-led group based at the University of Oxford, but open to the wider public, so we're very happy to have you here. You can always join our sessions, and the idea about this program is to discuss the theoretical basis upon which we can continue developing and discussing these Southern perspectives on criminology. This term, we are collecting many specialists that are not necessarily criminologists, but who have developed these bases that are enriching our discussion. So I will hand over to Luis, who will tell you a bit more about Professor Connell, and then start our session for today.
Thank you, Carla. Hi, everyone. I'd just like to echo Carla and thank Professor Raewyn Connell for accepting our invitation and joining us in what is a relatively late time in Australia. So thank you so much, Raewyn. And yeah, so Professor Raewyn Connell will present on thinking social science on a world scale. This will take about half an hour, and then we'll have another time for a discussion, something about 45 minutes or so. I'm pretty sure that you all know how online sessions are organized now, so I just ask you to kindly mute themselves during her talk, and then during the Q&A, you can all use the Teams to raise your hand, or eventually just use the chat if you prefer, either write in a queue to indicate you'd like to ask a question, or you could just write the full question there. We'll try and collate some questions, and then Professor Connell will address them in turn. You have realized that by now that we're recording the session, but we won't record the discussion, and then we're gonna upload it on the criminologist playlist in the Oxford Law Faculty YouTube page, where you could also see all our previous sessions. Yeah. Raewyn Connell is Professor Emerita, University of Sydney, and life member of the National Tertiary Education Union. She has taught in several countries and is widely cited as sociological researcher, the author of Gender and Power, Masculinities, and Southern Theory. Her recent books include The Guild University and Gênero em Termos Reais, which is a Portuguese version. Her work has been translated in 20 languages, and she's been active in the labour movement and the peace movement and work for gender equality. So, Professor Connell, welcome, and once again, thanks for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you kindly. I'm very glad to be here and be part. We have a little technical problem between the system here and the system there. So we will be using a rather primitive technique of saying when the next slide has to come up, the way that used to happen with the old celluloid slides and projectors. So think of this as a little bit of time travel as well as travel through space. What I'm planning to do in the next half hour is not specifically argue for Southernizing criminology. You've had other people who are more competent than I am to do that, and there are now a number of scholars around the world who've made significant contributions in that area. What I want to do is offer some of the deep background, if you like, to the project of changing criminology. I want to discuss how we can understand social science in general, which I take to include legal studies, criminology, jurisprudence, and so forth. How we can understand social science as a social product itself on a world scale, rather than in the local or national or perhaps just continental scale that the issue is usually discussed. So this was a kind of exercise in the sociology of knowledge. It's one that has been forced on me as I've tried to come to terms with the history of the social science discipline that I have mainly spent my time in, that is sociology, but also in others which I have studied or worked in at various times. And what is common to the history of all of these disciplines is a Eurocentric narrative of how they came into being, how they developed, and what they are. So in sociology, of course, there is the ridiculous but very influential story of the three founding fathers, the dead white men, Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, of course, who are supposed to have had this brilliant set of insights about European modernity from which sociology is supposed to have grown, a story that is completely falsified by the actual facts of the origins of sociology, but let us let that pass. But also in areas like criminology, you have foundation stories involving figures like Lombroso, stories of development towards quantitative modelling and so on, so forth, the modern features of the discipline. So there is a kind of, if you like, native mythology of academic disciplines, which essentially is a story about development within Europe and North America, within the North Atlantic world. Now, the more I got into the history of sociology, the more I came to question the accuracy of this kind of story. And I came towards another view of the history of social science within the wider perspective of the what I call the research-based knowledge formation, that is the full set of academic disciplines that make up the contemporary university curriculum, and the connection between that spectrum of disciplines and the history of global empire. That, it seemed to me, was the fundamental framework which we needed to understand the real history of sociology and other social sciences. So I need to spend a little bit of time giving some key features of this way of thinking about the history of the modern knowledge formation, the university curriculum. And here, if I could have the first slide, please. Could we now change? Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so the history I'm talking about now is the 500 years of the formation of the modern sciences, including social sciences, and its fundamental connection with the history of the creation, expansion, consolidation, transformation of European-based empires and those overland empires at the edges of the European world in North America and in Asia, in Siberia and Central Asia, where a different form of imperial conquest occurred. This is a picture, what you're looking at here is a picture of the 19th century British colonization of the continent that they called Australia. And although it's drawn by an artist and published in a colonial magazine, there's a little bit of fantasy about it. The artist has somehow got Australian Aboriginal people mixed up with inhabitants of the Pacific Islands. But in broad terms, the picture is accurate. A low-intensity war was fought across the continent. A military conquest occurred. And a colonial society was created in the lands that had previously, for 60,000 or more years, been occupied by Indigenous people. That process of conquest is, central to the whole story of empire, but it always went together with an economic integration as creation of a colonial economy, which became part of an imperial political economy. And the reason why the empires were founded, of course, was the dividends that European states, elites and military forces expected to gain from colonial conquest. The dividend in gold and spices in the first generations of overseas in European imperialism, a dividend in bodies, most catastrophically in the form of the slave trade in the Atlantic world, but also a dividend in bodies in terms of the formation of local workforces for the colonial economy, that is plantation workforces, mining workforces and so forth. And finally, there was a dividend in knowledge, which was recognised early on as the first of the overseas conquerors sent back information and specimens to the metropole, to the European centre. A dividend in knowledge that steadily grew over the next 500 years. And it's in that dividend that a very significant part of the history of modern sciences, including the natural sciences as well as the social sciences, is found. So if we could have the next slide, please. I want to show you just one moment in the extraction of that dividend. This is a naval vessel, literally a warship, His Majesty's ship, a British naval vessel called the Beagle, in the early 19th century. And it's shown off the coast of South America, very far south of where Chile meets Argentina and the Antarctic. And on that ship was a young scientist called Charles Darwin, who after 3 years of exploration in the colonial and post-colonial world, brought back to Europe a dividend of knowledge in the form of geological knowledge, biological knowledge, and more, social knowledge as well. And a good part of that, what he brought back, then went into the formulation of the theory of evolution and the foundation of modern biology. So the dividend of empire is that important. And we can trace back in the history of the social sciences and in many of the natural sciences, astronomy, biology, zoology, botany, and so on and so forth, the tremendous dividend of imperial expansion that went into the construction of the modern scientific knowledge formation. Now, this, although it was initially done by individual explorers, conquerors, missionaries, and so forth, it eventually became institutionalized and organized traffic in knowledge, which came to form an economy in its own right. It's what I call the global economy of knowledge, and you'll find a chapter about it in my book, The Good University, describing it. And one of the fundamental features of this economy is a worldwide division of labour which divides two forms of labour involved in the production of disciplinary knowledge. One is the encounter with the world that is involved in the collection of data, and the other is the theorising, the interpretation, the finding patterns in the information which is involved in producing theory. And that is something that happens, so in different forms, in all academic disciplines. For me, the crucial moment in understanding that came, could I have the next slide, please? When I encountered the work of this man, Pauline Ntonji, who is a philosopher from West Africa, who developed a model of the economy of knowledge, which emphasised the global division of labour between data gathering and theorising, which was also an institutionalised division between the colony, the colonised world, and the global metropole, the imperial centre, or more specifically, the knowledge institutions, the elite knowledge institutions of the imperial centre. It means the universities like Harvard and Oxford. It means the botanic gardens, and the scientific societies, the apparatus of scientific journals, and so on and so forth. So as the economy of knowledge crystallised, it had built into it this worldwide division of labour in which the colonised and eventually post-colonial world became basically a giant data mine, and the knowledge workers in the colonial world were obliged to adjust to this global division of labour, where the theory was produced in the imperial centre, in the metropole and its knowledge institutions, by adopting a specific attitude which placed them in a subordinate role. It's what Ntonji calls the attitude of extroversion, which is being translated, means an attitude of intellectual subordination, which makes you a provider of materials rather than a producer of concepts, frameworks, and methods yourself. And that is something I recognise as an Australian. Although Australia is a rich country, it's still a peripheral one. And it described exactly the nature of academic life in Australia. We imported theory from Europe and North America, imported methods from Europe and North America, and we supplied data. We fitted those theories to our local data and either published them locally or sent them off to a journal in the metropole, which would recognise them because it used concepts and methods that they were familiar with, and that would produce, you know, Australia's contribution to the global economy of knowledge. So it's not just the poorer countries of the world who are in this situation. It is a situation of peripheralness in the whole system. And that produces a very characteristic pattern in the distribution of knowledge. If we could have the next slide, please. This is a map of the world, but a very informative map of the world for our discussion, because it shows countries with area proportion to the number of academic journals that they publish in all disciplines across social sciences and natural sciences together. So you can see the immense dominance of the North America and United Kingdom, specifically United States and United Kingdom, followed by the rest of Europe, Scandinavia and Germany in particular, and the rest of the world, Latin America, Australia, most of Asia, pretty much nowhere. Now that changed, that's a map from a few years ago, produced by a couple of clever geographers from Oxford, I might say. And the situation has changed a little bit since then, because the Chinese regime has been pouring money into certain areas, technoscience and biomedical science, and increasing the number of journals from China. But that's still broadly the situation, and it's been like that ever since scientific journals began to be published. So you can see, something of the gross inequality in the global economy of knowledge on a world scale. Now, some of that has to do with resources. The global north is richer than the rest of the world, and the elite institutions of the global north are just fantastically rich. So Harvard, which is a middle-sized university, maybe even a smallish university, has a purse in which it has $42 billion. That's its endowment. And if you compare that with a mainstream university, even in a rich country like Australia, let alone a mainstream university in South America or in South Asia, I mean, the disproportion is staggering. So there are material reasons for these inequalities, but there's also a cultural hegemony established through mechanisms like extroversion and the global division of labour, where the elite knowledge institutions of the global north basically provide the frameworks within which disciplinary knowledge is produced all around the world, in the north, in the south, in the east, the west, wherever you go. Now, this story is, I'm sure, familiar to most of the people here, but it's not necessarily something we think about in an organised way. We experience its effects, but take them somehow as for granted. And this seminar, I think, is important because it exactly problematises that taken for grantedness of the disciplinary knowledge system that we are so familiar with. Now, I don't call that knowledge system Western science or Western knowledge because, as I've argued, in the history of the formation of the disciplinary knowledge formation, the knowledge system, the rest of the world has been involved and provided a great deal of the material through which that knowledge system was built. So if we want to give it a political name, we'd have to call it, I think, the imperial knowledge system rather than simply the Western one, which gets us into cultural essentialism anyway. It's a global system which is hegemonized by the institutions of the global north, but in which many other people and communities participate, and in which there are other possible knowledge formations too. So I now want to look at some of the knowledge formations that were excluded by the growth of the global economy of knowledge, by the growth of the imperial knowledge system. And it turns out that there is a wealth of alternative knowledge frameworks. If I could have the next slide, please. So one of the most discussed alternatives is Indigenous knowledge, and a good deal of the debate over decoloniality from scholars with interest in Latin America has counterposed the European knowledge system with Indigenous knowledge in regions like South America. This is an illustration of Indigenous knowledge from Australia, which is also a colonial country, post-colonial country, but an example of settler colonialism, which perhaps has relatively close analogies in Argentina, certainly in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in Canada, and some other places too. But this is an example of Aboriginal knowledge, knowledge as represented in a painting by a group of women from an Aboriginal community in the Central Desert region of Australia, in a style which is now actually the most celebrated art style that has come out of Australia. This is a painting called Sugar Leaf Dreaming. And it's based on a particular story, a dreaming story, which is a term used in Australia to describe the mixture of practical and ceremonial knowledge that's associated with particular groups of people in the Aboriginal community. The story, the mythical story in this, I won't go into great detail, but I want you to know that it tells about certain plants, it tells about the location of water, and it tells us about social information as well. It tells a story, in fact, which is a kind of, as we might see it in Anglophone terms, as a Romeo and Juliet story of love between a young man and a young woman who are by custom forbidden to marry. And as everybody knows, in Shakespeare's play of Romeo and Juliet, the stage at the end is littered with bodies because the conflict can't be resolved. And so the hero and heroine have to die. But in this story, the conflict is resolved, so that the painting actually embeds social knowledge about what we might call conflict resolution, how you deal with certain kinds of social conflict is embedded in this image and the stories that go with it. So it's also a quotation of Aboriginal law, of the wisdom of the elders who pass down traditions about the management of certain kinds of social conflict. Okay, that's one example of an alternative knowledge system which combines natural science knowledge, geographical knowledge, social knowledge, and ceremony. There are other, that is a form of knowledge which is very specifically place-based. It's connected with a specific community and a particular part of the landscape. But there are other alternative knowledge systems which are, in principle, universal, not local. If I could have the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I've got things out of order. So forget this for a moment. This is not what I had intended at this point in the story. I wanted to show an example of Islamic scholarship. And I will hasten over that so I can get back to my text. But I want to emphasize that in Islamic jurisprudence, for instance, there is a highly developed system of knowledge, organized system of knowledge and its application, which can be extended to political and social analysis, and can be extended into a kind of case law too, and which is in principle not attached to a very specific location or a specific community. It's meant to have general application, that is to say, meant to be logically universal. The third example, the third type of knowledge I wanted to point to is what our picture is illustrating. The man shown with the bicycle is Solomon Sekisho Plache, who at the time was the secretary of the organization that later became the African National Congress in South Africa, which is now the government of the country. This is a picture from more than 100 years ago, at a time when the white government of the recently unified colonies that became the Union of South Africa had passed legislation in the year 1913 to take the land held by Indigenous cultivators, take that away from them, basically turn Indigenous farmers into landless labourers, hand the land over to white commercial farmers, and so set up a commercial, white-controlled commercial farming economy on land that had been previously controlled and farmed by Indigenous communities. It was, in fact, legislation for a massive, massive land theft. And of course, you can describe empire as a massive land theft too, if you like. You can regard empire itself as a crime on a gigantic scale, imperial conquest against the will of the inhabitants of the given land. And there were certainly anti-imperialist figures in the colonial world who saw it in exactly those terms. So I'm thinking here, for instance, of Al-Afghani, one of the Islamic theorists whom I discuss in the book Southern Theory, who basically regarded the English in South Asia as a band of robbers who'd arrived, taken over by force, in order to rip off the inhabitants and set up colonies and trading systems and semi-colonies like Iran in their own interest. And what are we talking about here is knowledge, all right. Both Al-Afghani and Platcher were knowledge producers and in fact wrote intensely interesting work about the rather different situations they were in. What you're seeing actually is Platcher doing sociological fieldwork for the book that he published in 1916, which is called Native Life in South Africa. It sounds like the story of an African farm, but it's not. It's the story of that legislation, that land theft legislation. He bicycled around, because of course black people couldn't afford horses or cars in South Africa at the time, interviewing the displaced families. It's a stunning piece of sociological research on the social dislocation and displacement that's produced by colonial power in the creation of a colonial society. And that is essentially what I call Southern theory, the knowledge produced within colonial and later post-colonial societies in the knowledge of the existence of empire and the kinds of social consequences that flow from empire. And then finally, if I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. Last year, as I'm sure many of you know, in Southeast Australia, we had a serious drought and then some absolutely devastating bushfires in which a large number of people died. And one of the features of this, this set of events was the refusal of our national government to take preventative measures in the form of measures against the climate change that was producing the conditions for this kind of thing happen, and then an slow and incompetent response to the fires themselves. Now, this is particularly distressing in Australia because there's in fact a lot of knowledge about bushfires, about the Australian bush, about fire in relation to that bush, produced by Indigenous communities who for a very long time had actually done, among other forms of relationship to the land, had done controlled fire farming in order to produce food resources. And also there is local knowledge in the hands of many of the settler population as well, the white settler population who now greatly outnumber the Indigenous people, but who also have generations of experience in the bush in dealing with fire. So there is a kind of stunning mismatch between the political response and the local forms of knowledge about this problem, which could have been mobilized by an intelligent regime. What I'm pointing to there is the existence of local knowledges, practice-based local knowledges, which we find not only in forestry and dealing with with open country, but also in fisheries, for instance, fisher communities develop, intense local knowledge about the fish species, their habits, the seasonal changes, the tides, the conditions of the water, oceanography, and so on and so forth, which is organised around practice rather than around abstract requirements of knowledge. So here's another example of a body of knowledge which is actually produced, actually is there in the world, but is not necessarily accessed. That's intended to suggest that the creation of the disciplinary knowledge system and the global economy of knowledge around disciplinary knowledge has actually excluded rich resources of knowledge and other ways of organising and thinking about facts and principles, which also exist in the world. Those are resources that are still there in many cases in one form or another, and which would be available if our knowledge practices were organised to connect with them. So that's my if you like, my tour of the world. I want to finish up by a couple of comments on why it matters to think this way, why it matters to recognise the imperial roots of the disciplinary knowledge system and the alternatives that were excluded as the disciplinary knowledge system became institutionalised. I want to suggest three ways in which we can think. I mean, we can think about in the social sciences, for instance, theory, when theory is produced, it generally has connection with the social experiences of the group, from whom it is produced. So if theory in the social sciences is principally produced in Europe and North America, it's going to reflect in one way or another the social experience of the people of Europe and North America. Now, the people of Europe and North America added together are just 14% of the global population. That is, 1 in 7 humans live in those regions and thus have a chance of having their experience, closely reflected in the theoretical work in the modern social sciences. But that means 6 out of 7 people live in other parts of the world, and their experience is much less likely to be reflected in the processes through which theory is produced. So we're likely to have then, in social science, limited forms of conceptualization, limited conceptual apparatus, because it doesn't arise in any direct way from the social experience of the majority of the world's population. And that's why I think it's very important. If I could have the next image and then the next image after that. This is Ashia Mbembe, author on the celebrated book On the Post-Colony, and more recently the Critique of Black Reason, which I think is an essential reading for anyone concerned to theorise in social sciences today. If I could have the next picture, please. This is Aníbal Quijano, a Peruvian sociologist. Ashia, I should have mentioned, is working in South Africa at the moment, though originally comes from Central Africa. Aníbal Quijano, recently deceased, unfortunately, sociologist from Peru, is the author of The Concept of the Coloniality of Power, which has now increasingly circulated in discussions of decolonising sociology, decolonising knowledge too. because it speaks to the way in which the organisation of institutions in colonial society was oriented towards the relationship with the metropole. That was a feature of the colonial society, but after political independence, after formal independence, that pattern of institutionalization persisted, so that there is still an orientation of economic and political and knowledge institutions in the post-colonial world to the institutions of the global north. And that is, if you like, a fundamental concept in understanding the economy of knowledge as it is in understanding the global economy of power and wealth. So the limitation of our theoretical apparatus by the current mechanisms of the economy of knowledge is the first reason that it matters to do the kind of work that we're doing. The second reason is that important problems are excluded or marginalised in social science by the way the global economy of knowledge is structured. If I could have the next image, please. I've mentioned when I was showing the picture of Sol Plaatje and talking about the 1913 Native Land Act in South Africa, I mentioned that example of a massive theft of land. Now, land is not a concept you will often find in Northern social theory, in the work of European sociologists or North American sociologists. That's a concept that you don't find. It's not a significant issue, but it is front and center issue in colonization, in colonialism. I mean, the taking of land is perhaps even the defining feature of colonization. It's immensely important. And I wanted to show you a picture of Bina Agarwal, an Indian economist, feminist, socialist feminist, and environmental thinker, extraordinarily interesting intellectual, who I think, has a claim to be the most important feminist theorist of our era, and she's a great deal more than that too. One of her key works is a book called A Field of One's Own, in which she examined the interplay between gender relations in a variety of settings across South Asia, and the ownership and use of land, including farming, forestry, and so on and so forth. So it was a bringing of the issue of land and the relationship of social structure to land right into the centre of analysis of one of the largest societies in the world. Extraordinarily interesting book. So that's an example of work from the global south about issues that are enormously important in colonisation in post-colonial societies, which are grossly under-theorised in the theoretical apparatus that's been developed by intellectuals working in the global north. And when we think about the uses of knowledge, can I have the next picture, please? This is Maggie Walter, a colleague of mine in sociology in Australia, an Indigenous sociologist, who is the co-author of a, I think, fascinating and important book called Indigenous Statistics. Now, this might seem a little strange given the previous example I showed you of an Indigenous, product of Indigenous thinking from Central Australia, but we're now, in the colony. We are in the colonised world of contemporary Australia, where Indigenous people can be regarded as an ethnic minority, and their relationship with the land and their culture can be overridden by a racist colonial government, such as we currently have. And the cruel and disruptive policies adopted by that government can be justified by an appeal to statistics, and these policies always are justified by an appeal to statistics collected by the central government Census Bureau or other government agencies or even private providers of knowledge, which always show Aboriginal people as in some way in deficit, as in some way inferior, as lagging behind the gap between Aboriginal people and other groups of people in Australia, is the rhetoric of government policy. Now, Maggie Walter's argument in Indigenous Statistics and in the political work, political and intellectual work that she and her colleagues have been doing around these issues has been exactly contesting this use of statistics as a means of denigration and marginalisation of Aboriginal communities. As a counterblast to that is the assertion of data sovereignty, the claim that data is a resource which should be controlled by Indigenous people in the way that other resources should be controlled, and statistics should be collected that are of active use for Indigenous communities' own purposes. So this is using in a mathematical methodology the same kind of argument that Linda Tuhiwai-Smith develops around community-based social research using qualitative techniques in her celebrated book, Decolonising Methodologies, from Aotearoa, New Zealand. So the uses of knowledge are, I think, crucial issues for the social sciences. And these post-colonial struggles have been showing how the imperial knowledge formation has used knowledge in oppressive and intrusive ways with Indigenous communities, but that can be turned around and is being turned around by the work of scholars today. So those are the main issues that I wanted to introduce to you. Decolonising the social sciences, that I talked about a great deal today, is still, I think, at a fairly early stage of development. It undoubtedly is a project that faces many problems. Some of them are practical problems. Where are the resources for this work? Some of them are workforce problems. I mean, the development of knowledge requires a knowledge workforce. Where is that coming from? Well, part of it is increasingly being trained at the moment, but it is still, fairly small compared with the resources of the mainstream system. There are also epistemological problems. The global economy of knowledge works by a kind of pyramid epistemology, top-down system where frameworks are constructed in the global centre and trickle down to, I'm mixing metaphors madly here. Many of the critics of the current global economy of knowledge offer us a kind of mosaic epistemology where different knowledge systems are presumed to coexist, more or less separate from each other, though perhaps producing a colourful effect like a mosaic overall. But there are also other possibilities which rest on connection with respect between different knowledge projects, and especially between different knowledge projects coming out of the Global South, Indigenous knowledge, alternative universalism, Southern theories, local knowledges, and so forth. They can be in solidarity with each other, and the groups who produce those knowledges can have connections with each other if we are willing to engage in respectful mutual learning. If I could have the next slide, please. This is exactly the argument of my colleague Chilla Bulbeck's book, Reorienting Western Feminisms, which takes up the issue of feminist frameworks of knowledge in different parts of the world and the colonial critique of northern white middle-class feminism, and argues for what Chilla Bulbeck calls braiding at the borders, connecting frameworks, ways of thought, strategies, and bodies of knowledge through respectful interaction without the attempt to colonize other knowledge resources. So those are among the alternatives that we can find. The debates that I'm talking about do go back in time. This is not exactly a recent invention, though the issues have certainly hotted up recently, but there are resources out there. Sometimes you have to work hard to track them down, but in my experience, they're infinitely worth finding and studying. The prospect of a decolonized sociology or social science generally, in my view, is social knowledge built on the experience of the whole of humanity, not selectively prioritizing a particular part. And even before we get to that utopian condition of social science, the simple effort to reach out to study other frameworks and other knowledge projects and other resources that already exist will give us a far richer archive from which we can build projects in disciplines like criminology, sociology, psychology, economics, whatever they may be. And that's the thought that I want to leave you with. We are not trying specifically to demolish existing knowledge resources. We are trying to enrich the global archive of knowledge from which knowledge can in future be built. So those are my arguments. Now, if I could, the last screen, thank you, for people who want the spelling of the names of the different people I've mentioned. And you will find there the missing slide was one showing a picture entirely mythological of the Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun from North Africa. Story you will hear from other people, I'm sure. Thank you.